Wage labor did avoid some of the worst physical dangers and financial risks of independent enterprises, but introduced its own hardships. Industrial safety standards were virtually non-existent. Workers in frontier factories, mills, and workshops suffered horrific injuries from unguarded machinery. Construction workers built increasingly tall structures without harnesses or safety equipment, leading to frequent fatal falls. Railroad work was particularly dangerous. Track layers worked with minimal equipment under brutal conditions, suffering high rates of injury and death from accidents, heat stroke, and exhaustion. Chinese workers, who built much of the transcontinental railroad, were often assigned the most dangerous tasks, such as handling unstable explosives to blast through mountain passes. Working hours were long by modern standards, typically 10-12 hours per day, 6 days per week. Pay was low, with most workers barely earning subsistence wages. Child labour was common, with children as young as 8 or 9 working alongside adults in many industries, often suffering higher injury rates due to their size and inexperience. Workers had essentially no legal protections. Employers could fire people without cause, reduce wages arbitrarily, or withhold pay entirely. Those who complained or attempted to organise for better conditions faced blacklisting, being marked as troublemakers who no other employer in the region would hire. Company towns, settlements where a single employer owned all housing and businesses, were common in mining and lumber regions. Workers in these communities paid inflated prices at company stores, lived in company housing, and sometimes were paid in scrip, company currency, rather than legal tender. This created a form of debt bondage where workers could never save enough to escape the system. Whether you mined, ranched, farmed, or worked for wages, frontier life shaped your experiences in ways modern people would find disorienting. Perhaps most striking was the relationship with time, not the carefully measured minutes and hours of our digital age, but a more fluid reality, governed by daylight, seasons, and natural rhythms. Without electric lighting, most people woke at dawn and slept shortly after sunset, their active hours expanding and contracting with the seasons. Work wasn't measured in 8-hour shifts, but by tasks that needed completion. Fields ploughed, cattle moved, ore extracted. During harvest or roundup, people might work from first light until well after dark for weeks without a break. During winter, many rural workers had periods of relative inactivity when fields lay dormant or cattle needed minimal tending. The concept of punctuality, so central to modern life, had limited relevance on the frontier. With few clocks and limited need for precise timing in most activities, people operated on approximate schedules. Stagecoaches and later trains introduced more precise timetables to the West. But outside these specific contexts, morning or after dinner were sufficiently specific time designations for most purposes. Entertainment and leisure looked nothing like their modern counterparts. After exhausting workdays, most frontier folks had little energy for complex activities. Conversation around the fire, storytelling, or simple card games were common evening pastimes. Music was popular when instruments and skilled players were available, with fiddles, harmonicas, and guitars providing accompaniment for social dances. Reading material was precious and often shared among entire communities. A single book might be read aloud to gatherings of neighbours or passed from family to family until it fell apart from use. Newspapers, when available, were read repeatedly, with every advertisement and notice scrutinised for information about the wider world. Organised sports existed, but in simpler forms than today. Baseball was gaining popularity, played with minimal equipment on makeshift fields. Horse racing, wrestling, and shooting competitions provided both entertainment and opportunities to demonstrate valuable skills. Children played games that required little or no equipment: tag, hide and seek, and variations of stickball that could be played with found objects. holidays and community celebrations took on great importance as rare opportunities for socializing and recreation. 4th of July celebrations might draw people from miles around for picnics, speeches, games, and dancing. Harvest festivals marked the successful completion of the year's most critical work. Religious holidays provided both spiritual meaning and welcome breaks from routine. As the day draws to a close, you find yourself reflecting on the relentless challenges of frontier life. Every aspect required harder work, involved greater risk, and offered fewer comforts than its modern equivalent. The people who survived and sometimes thrived in these conditions possessed qualities that modern society rarely demands: extraordinary physical endurance, practical skills applicable to countless emergencies, and psychological resilience in the face of constant hardship and loss. The darkness gathers once more, and with it comes a silence profound enough to hear your own heartbeat. No car engines, no air conditioners, no electronic hums, just the whisper of wind, the chorus of insects, and the occasional call of night birds. This profound quiet, so alien to modern ears, was the soundtrack of frontier nights, sometimes comforting, sometimes unsettling in its emptiness. As you drift towards sleep, you wonder if you would have had what it took to survive here, not just for a day or a week, but for years and decades. The people who shaped the American West, for better and worse, were not the idealized heroes of later fiction, but complex individuals facing extraordinary challenges with the limited resources and knowledge of their time. Their story, stripped of romanticism, is one of human endurance against conditions that would break many of us today. The cool night air settles around you like a blanket, and the stars emerge in a display of brilliance impossible to see in our light-polluted modern world. This at least is one pure beauty the people of the frontier experienced that few today can fully appreciate. The majestic sweep of the Milky Way across a truly dark sky, connecting them to the same cosmic panorama their ancestors had watched for countless generations. Morning arrives again in the Wild West, and with it comes hunger, a constant companion on the frontier. Food in the 1870s, West bore little resemblance to the varied, convenient diet you're accustomed to in the modern world. Let's explore what keeping yourself fed would actually entail in this harsh environment. The good news is that game was still relatively plentiful in many areas. Deer, elk, rabbit, and various birds could supplement your diet if you had the skills to hunt them. The bad news? Hunting required ammunition, which was expensive and might be needed for protection. It also demanded time away from other essential work, making it a luxury many settlers couldn't afford during busy seasons. Most frontier families relied heavily on foods they could grow, preserve, or purchase in bulk. The staples of the frontier diet were beans, corn, and pork, dense in calories but monotonous and nutritionally incomplete. Fresh fruits and vegetables were available only in season, a few months at most. And winter diets often contained no fresh produce whatsoever. This lack of dietary variety led to widespread nutritional deficiencies. Scurvy, caused by vitamin C deficiency, was common during winter and early spring when no fresh produce was available. The symptoms, bleeding gums, loosening teeth, joint pain, and eventually death, were well known but difficult to prevent with available resources. Other deficiency diseases affected growth in children and caused various chronic health problems in adults. Food preservation was a constant challenge and critical survival skill. Without refrigeration, meat needed to be consumed quickly or preserved through smoking, salting, or drying. These methods deterred bacterial growth but drastically changed flavors and textures while reducing nutritional value. The heavy salt content of preserved foods contributed to high blood pressure and other health issues. Women spent enormous amounts of time preserving food when it was abundant for use during scarce periods. Vegetables were pickled in vinegar or fermented. Fruits were dried or preserved with sugar if available. Root vegetables might be stored in root cellars, underground spaces that maintained cool temperatures. These preservation efforts were not optional activities, but essential survival work that could determine whether a family would eat during winter. Food storage presented its own problems. Properly prepared preserved foods could last months or even years, but improper techniques led to spoilage and potentially deadly food poisoning. Additionally, stored food attracted pests. Rats, mice, and insects consumed portions of most stored food supplies, and their droppings contaminated what remained. Most frontier families simply accepted a certain amount of insect parts and rodent droppings in their flour, beans, and other staples as unavoidable. Cooking itself was far more labor-intensive than modern people can easily comprehend. Meals were prepared over open hearths or wood-burning stoves that required constant attention and fuel. In wood-scarce prairie regions, women and children might spend hours gathering buffalo chips, dried manure, or twisted grass to burn as cooking fuel. Water had to be hauled from wells or streams, often hundreds of pounds per day for cooking, cleaning, and drinking. Even with these efforts, meals lacked the variety and flavor profiles modern people expect. Spices were expensive luxuries, used sparingly, if at all. Sugar and coffee were treasured items, often hoarded for special occasions. Fresh milk was available only if a family kept a cow, and for only part of the year when the cow was producing. Most frontier children grew up with simple, repetitive diets that would horrify modern nutritionists. Interestingly, despite these limitations, obesity was rare on the frontier. The combination of limited food supplies, minimal sugar consumption, and constant physical labor kept most people lean. However, this leanness wasn't necessarily healthy. Many frontier folks suffered from malnutrition even when they had sufficient calories to sustain their work. Beyond basic survival needs like food, frontier life presented unique challenges for families raising children. If you had been born in the Wild West, rather than just visiting it, your childhood would have been dramatically different from modern experiences. Childhood itself was conceived differently in the 19th century. Children as young as 6 or 7 were expected to contribute meaningful work to family survival, not as educational chores, but as essential economic contributions. Young children minded livestock, gathered eggs, picked vegetables, watched younger siblings, and helped with countless other tasks that freed adults for heavier work. By age 10 or 12, most frontier children worked alongside adults at nearly adult capacity. Boys followed fathers into fields, barns, or workshops, learning skills through direct participation rather than formal instruction. Girls worked with mothers, learning the complex domestic skills necessary for frontier homemaking. Not simple housekeeping, but the production of essential goods like clothing, preserved food, candles, and soap. This early adulthood extended to other areas of life. Children were not sheltered from the harsh realities around them. They witnessed births, deaths, slaughtering of animals, and the sometimes violent conflicts of frontier communities. They were expected to understand and adapt to these realities, rather than being protected from them. Education, as modern people understand it, was limited and inconsistent on the frontier. In established towns, schools might operate for a few months each year, typically during winter when agricultural work was minimal. One teacher, often barely educated themselves, might be responsible for students ranging from 5 to 17 years old, all studying in a single room. Physical conditions in these schools were challenging. Buildings were poorly insulated, leading to freezing conditions in winter and stifling heat in warmer months. Supplies were minimal, perhaps a few shared textbooks, slates for writing that had to be constantly erased and reused, and minimal paper that was treated as a precious resource. Corporal punishment was the standard disciplinary approach, with whippings or beatings administered for infractions as minor as whispering or failing to memorize assigned material. In more remote areas, formal schooling might not exist at all. Some families conducted home education using whatever books were available, but many frontier children received only the most basic literacy and calculation skills, if that. Their education focused instead on practical knowledge: how to predict weather, track animals, prepare soil for planting, treat common injuries, and perform the countless other tasks essential for survival. Child mortality remained devastatingly high throughout the frontier period. Approximately 1 in 4 children died before reaching adulthood, with the highest risk in the first 5 years of life. Diseases that modern medicine easily prevents or treats: measles, diphtheria, scarlet fever, whooping cough, routinely killed or permanently disabled young children. Accidents claimed many more, as child safety was a foreign concept in an era where survival demanded risk-taking. The psychological impact of this mortality on both children and parents is difficult for modern people to comprehend. Most children grew up watching siblings die. Parents expected to lose children and often gave the same name to a subsequent child if an older sibling died young. A practice that seems strange today, but reflected the different relationship with mortality in an era when death was an everyday presence. Perhaps nothing illustrates the gulf between frontier and modern life more clearly than approaches to health and medicine. If you became ill or injured in the 1870s West, your experience would bear almost no resemblance to modern healthcare. The first difference would be the absence of professional medical care in most situations. Doctors were scarce, with many communities having none at all. Those who did practice on the frontier often had minimal training, perhaps a brief apprenticeship or a few months at a medical college. Their knowledge reflected medical science of the era, which still relied heavily on theories like humoral balance that had more in common with medieval medicine than modern practice. Without access to professional care, most health issues were addressed through home remedies